January 1929. Central Mongolia, where the steppe is so flat, the sky feels close enough to touch. The wind doesn't arrive like weather. It arrives like a verdict. It slides over bare grass, gathers speed for 100 uninterrupted miles, and then hits a camp as if it has been sent there on purpose. That week, the air fell below -40 degrees Celsius, and the next night, the mercury sank again. Men who'd ridden through wars said they could hear trees splitting in the river valley, sharp cracks carried by cold. Out here, there were no trees to split, just rope-felt bone-dry dung and whatever you built with your hands. On the edge of a winter pasture, Batsaikon began doing something that looked foolish. From a distance, he wrapped a perfectly good jeer inside another skin extra, felt extra ropes, a second collar at the base, and a low windbreak ringed tight to the earth. A neighbor watched from his saddle and laughed once, like a man watching someone argue with the horizon. But Batsaikon didn't answer. He kept tightening knots until his fingers stopped obeying. Batsaikon wasn't a mystic, and he wasn't trying to impress anyone. Before he returned to herding, he'd spent 6 winters as a mechanic at a rail depot near the Russian border, the kind of job that teaches you what cold does to metal grease and human mistakes. He'd learned to measure first, talk later, so when the elders said, "A gur is warm enough if you live like your father did," he nodded politely and started taking notes anyway. He carried 2 cheap thermometers from the depot, one tied outside the door frame, one hung from the roof ring inside. He kept a charcoal stub and a scrap ledger wrapped in oilcloth. On calm nights, the inside stayed tolerable. On wind nights, the floor turned cruel, and smoke behaved strangely, curling down instead of rising. That was the part that bothered him, not the cold itself. The way the wind stole heat before it ever became warmth. If you're watching from a place that still has power lines in winter, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the coldest temperature you've ever worked through. By the end, there will be a number in Batsaikon's ledger that made the laughing stop. The men who mocked him weren't ignorant. They simply trusted what looked solid squared timber huts, straight walls, sharp corners. A rectangle, they said, looks like a real house. Batsaikon had seen rectangles lose roofs in depot storms. Out here, wind found every flat face and treated it like a sail. He kept the jeer's shape low and round for a reason. A circle doesn't invite impact, it encourages flow. Wind that would slam into a wall slides around a curve, splits, rejoins, and keeps moving. And the roof sloping down to the lattice doesn't offer lift. It offers a ramp. When gusts tried to grab it, the force was pushed down into the ground, like a palm pressing a bowl into the dirt. Batsaikon built his windbreak in a ring, not a fence. A fence makes turbulence. A ring makes a shadow, quiet air that lets the felt do its work instead of fighting a constant stripping current. He was not trying to defeat winter. He was trying to deny it a grip. The first real test came with a white zood snow, so heavy it turned the world into a buried map. It arrived in waves each hour, laying a new layer, each gust packing it tighter. By afternoon, the sheep pens looked shallow. By evening, the steppe had disappeared, entirely replaced by a single pale surface, where even distance felt unreliable. Batsaikon's conical roof began to carry weight, not the gentle kind, the kind that keeps adding itself until something gives. He climbed out every few hours with a long pole and knocked snow down in controlled slides. Not too hard, hard impacts could loosen felt seams. Not too soft, soft meant slow, and slow meant collapse. Around his jeer, snow piled at the base and built a skirt, and for a moment it seemed like protection. It sealed drafts, it muffled the wind, it made the camp feel quieter. Then he smelled something wrong. Inside, smoke that should have escaped was lingering. A sweet, dangerous heaviness. Snow, he realized, was also sealing the breath of the house. That night he made a choice most people only learn once. Warmth is not the same as safety. He dug a narrow channel through the snowskirt, just enough to reopen a low air path near the door. He loosened a felt overlap at the roof ring by the width of 2 fingers, and then he watched the stove like it was a living thing. The flame told the truth. A clean burn sounded steady. A starved burn whispered and coughed. Inside, his mother wrapped the youngest child in sheepskins until only the child's nose showed. The boy's breathing sounded wet. He'd been coughing for days, the kind of cough that steals sleep and leaves everyone angry by morning. But Saikan moved the sleeping platforms higher using spare planks because cold air pools at the floor like water. He wasn't chasing comfort. He was chasing a margin, 1 more degree, 1 more hour, 1 less night of waking to frozen fingers. Outside, the wind hammered the snow like a drum. Inside, the gyr began to behave like a sealed instrument. Warm in the center, calmer at the edges, breathing just enough to live. When the storm eased, the mockery returned quietly, like men testing whether their pride still fit. One neighbor, Altan, rode over and pretended he was only curious about ropes. He stood at the door, glanced around, and made a small sound of surprise when his boots didn't immediately feel the floor bite. But Saikan didn't lecture. He showed him the simplest rule: stop wind before it touches your insulation. Wool can trap warmth, but it can't perform miracles if the wind is constantly combing through it. So he layered felt with deliberate overlaps like shingles and cinched it tight with tension bands so the wind couldn't lift edges. He explained the air gap dead air, the kind that acts like still water. 2 layers with quiet space between behave like double glass. Not because of magic, because moving air steals heat faster than cold air alone. Altan nodded and smiled as if he already knew. Then he asked very softly, "How much fuel are you burning?" But Saikan opened his ledger and tapped the page, but he didn't let him read it yet. The next disaster was the black Zood brutal cold with no snow to soften the earth. The ground went bare and hard, the kind of hard that makes hooves ring like tools. Wells froze down their throats. The river narrowed under ice until it sounded hollow. Without snow at the base, the gyrs felt met the frozen ground directly, and the ground stole heat like a thief. Batsakan had prepared for that. Before winter, he'd laid a thick mat of dry reeds and old felt scraps under the floor, then covered it with packed earth and a wool rug. It wasn't luxury, it was insulation against conduction. Fuel became the real argument. Out here, wood was too precious to burn. Wood was for repair: a cracked pole, a broken latch, a roof ring that might split. So the camp turned to what the herds provided. Batsaikan cut winter pen dung into dense blocks, dried them until they rang when tapped, and stacked them under a hide cover where wind couldn't re-wet them. Dry fuel meant clean burn. Wet fuel meant smoke soot and a pipe that could choke. Winter didn't care what you believed. It cared what you stored. Inside the gyr, the stove sat dead center. Not tradition for tradition's sake, but geometry. Heat rising from the middle hits the roof and rolls down the curved walls, creating a slow circulating loop that pushes warmth toward where people sleep. A square room creates corners where air stalls and chills. A circle denies winter those pockets. Batsaikan watched the chimney draft, the way he'd watched locomotives breathe. When the fire burned hot, the pipe pulled hard. When the fire weakened, the pull softened and cold air tried to sneak in low and steal the flame. So he left small planned gaps between felt layers, controlled intake, not accidental leaks. At minus 45 degrees Celsius, someone woke every few hours to feed the stove. They rotated the duty like a quiet pact. His eldest daughter took the midnight watch, with eyes half-closed, hands moving by memory, open place, close listen. The fire's sound became the family's clock. Outside, breath froze in the air so fast it glittered. Inside, tea steamed. The difference was not comfort. It was survival measured in hours. Then came the iron Zood, a false thaw that turned cruel. One day of weak sun softened the top layer of snow into slush. The camp dared to hope. The next night the temperature dropped like a trapdoor. Everything froze into a glass crust so hard animals couldn't break through to grass. Sheep pawed until their hooves bled, then stopped. Horses struck the ice and backed away, confused by a world that offered food but refused access. That kind of night steals heat in a different way. Ice reflects the sky's cold back at you, and the ground becomes a mirror for loss. Batsaihan felt it inside the floor, cooling faster than usual, the stove needing more fuel to hold the same warmth. He made the interior smaller. He hung a low felt curtain to shrink the heated volume, leaving a tighter sleeping zone around the perimeter and a working zone near the door that could stay colder without harming anyone. Heating less air is not cowardice, it is efficiency. Outside, the herds began to fail. Inside, a child finally slept without coughing. People like to imagine the felt is just a blanket. Batsaihan knew it behaved more like a living wall. Wool doesn't merely trap air, it manages moisture. Inside a winter gyre breath and boiling pots raise humidity. If that moisture freezes inside your insulation, you lose everything. Modern sealed materials turn into wet shells and then into ice. Felt, if made well, lets vapor migrate outward. It breathes without letting wind scour through. That balance is why his mother insisted on thick northern panels, and why he added a second layer over the south doorway where heat leaks fastest. There was another effect he didn't talk about around proud men because it sounded like superstition until you understood. Chemistry, dry wool absorbing moisture, releases a small amount of heat. Not enough to replace a stove, but enough to soften the nighttime fall, like a wall holding memory of warmth. Batsaihan didn't call it magic. He called it buffering. The kind of buffering that keeps a sleeping child from waking up shivering at 3 a.m. The cold death came last, an anomaly so deep it made elders whisper about past winters. No storm, no snow, just air that turned hostile. On Batsaihan's outside thermometer, the line fell to -50 degrees Celsius and sat there as if it belonged. The sky was clear and the stars looked sharp enough to cut. At that temperature, mistakes become immediate. Touch bare metal and skin sticks. Spill water and it hardens before it splashes flat. Strike a brittle tool the wrong way and it can crack. That night, Altan's squared hut went silent early. Not the peaceful kind, the dangerous kind. In a rectangular shelter, wind pressure creates strange suction that can pull warmth out through seams you didn't know existed. Batsaihan kept his stove alive with dense dung blocks, not many at once, but steadily, so the pipe stayed hot and the draft stayed clean. His family wore sheepskin-lined coats inside, not because they lacked warmth, but because warmth was precious and movement was expensive. Calories mattered. They ate fat and meat broth, slow fuel for the body, the same principle as the stove. Near midnight, someone knocked 3 fast hits. Then a pause. Altan stood outside with his scarf iced stiff and his pride stripped thin by necessity. Behind him, his youngest boy shivered in a blanket that looked too small for the job. No one said, "I told you." No one asked for an apology. The step was doing the judging, and it had already spoken. They brought the boy inside and sat him on the raised platform near the warmest wall, far from the door. Batsaihan's mother poured hot tea in a chipped bowl and made the boy drink slowly so he wouldn't choke. The child's hands were so cold they shook. Altan stared at the ceiling ring where smoke slipped out cleanly, and his eyes kept returning to the rope's thick wool band cinched tight around the lattice. He had built his hut with nails and metal brackets because metal feels permanent. In this cold, metal becomes a weakness, brittle, conductive, unforgiving. Batsaihan showed him the hide bindings, rawhide that shrinks tight when dried, holding with strength, but still flexing when the wind hits. Winter breaks rigid things, he said quietly, not just wood. Before dawn, Batsaikan finally opened the ledger, not to boast, to settle the argument the only way winter accepts, by numbers. On the worst night outside was minus 50 degrees Celsius. Inside, at head height near the sleeping platform, he had held plus 16 degrees Celsius. Near the floor by the door, it dipped to minus 2 degrees Celsius cold, but not deadly, and kept away from children by design. He wrote down fuel to 18 kilograms of dense dung blocks over 24 hours, fed in small loads every 2 to 3 hours. Altan swallowed hard because his own hut had burned nearly double that in a panic and still lost the battle. Batsaikan didn't claim miracles. He explained causes: dry fuel burns hotter and cleaner. A centered stove circulates heat evenly. A round wall sheds wind. A sealed but breathing felt envelope prevents wet insulation. A raised bed avoids the cold sink at the floor. Smaller heated volume costs less. They checked the thermometers together, tapping the glass, comparing readings, moving one outside and back inside. It wasn't a story, it was a demonstration, and the next day people stopped laughing. They started asking questions when they thought no one else could hear. Word moved the way practical knowledge always moves, not by speeches, but by borrowed tools and quiet visits. One family asked about the base skirt. Another asked how tight to cinch the tension bands so the roof poles wouldn't push the lattice outward. A third asked why Batsaikan left a controlled air path instead of sealing everything. He showed them with hands, not theory. Roof poles create outward force. The tension rope turns that outward force into a tightening ring. More snow load increases the outward push, which increases rope tension, which clamps the wall harder. Done right, the G-ear strengthens when pressured like a trap that tightens on itself. Done wrong, walls bow and the roof sags. He taught them to listen for felt flapping. Flapping is heat loss and seam failure in slow motion. Tight felt is silent. By late winter, the camp began to look different. More round silhouettes, more low windbreak rings, more smoke rising straight, clean, steady. But the step was not finished testing them. It never is. A month later, a government veterinary officer arrived from a distant district center, sent to count livestock losses and record where people had moved. He carried an official thermometer and a small notebook with neat handwriting. He also carried the kind of skepticism that comes from seeing too many miracle fixes fail. He walked the camp, noted broken fences, dead sheep, and the tired faces of men pretending they weren't afraid. Then he stopped at Batsaikan's jeer and asked permission to step in. Inside, the air was warm enough that the officer blinked like a man entering a different season. He held his instrument up, waited, wrote down the number. Then he asked to see the outside reading. They walked out together into air that snapped at eyelashes. The officer checked his thermometer again, wrote again, and made a small sound, not laughter, not praise, just the sound of someone adjusting what he thought was possible. He didn't call it genius. He called it proper construction under local conditions. But later in the district office, he drew a diagram: circular shelter tension bands, layered felt-controlled ventilation, raised sleeping platform, central stove, dry fuel storage. That diagram mattered. It turned a camp lesson into a method others could follow. Spring did not arrive like a rescue. It arrived like a thawing bruise. The ice crust broke in places, water ran in thin lines, and the herds that survived looked thin but alive. Batsaikan's family had lost animals too. No one beat a zood completely, but they had slept. And sleeping meant thinking, and thinking meant making better decisions when the world was punishing. His mother's hands healed. The cough in the children faded. The anger that comes from exhaustion loosened its grip. Altan rebuilt not a hut, but a better jer. He didn't copy blindly. He adapted. He thickened the north wall, lowered the profile, and replaced metal brackets with hide bindings. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it, the way a man looks at a repaired relationship, careful, hopeful, humbled. That was the true shift. Not warmth alone, but dignity restored. Winter had gone from a siege to a season you could work through. Still, one question remained the one. The step forces every family to answer sooner or later. What do you do when the pasture itself dies, when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving? Mobility was the final design feature, the one outsider's mistake for convenience. The G-ear was never meant to be a permanent argument with winter. It was meant to be an escape plan. When grass failed, when ice sealed the earth, when losses climbed toward ruin, herders moved not because they were restless, but because standing still can be fatal. A fixed house becomes a promise you might not be able to keep. A portable shelter is permission to survive. Batsakan timed the move the way he timed stove feeds. He waited for a calm window, dismantled the roof. Ring bundled poles, folded the lattice, rolled felt stacked ropes. The whole house became a load that could travel with the animals, the true source of fuel, food, and future. He had learned something harsh in the depot years. Infrastructure fails in the cold. Roads disappear. Supply trains don't come. The only system you can count on is the one you can carry and rebuild with your own hands. When the camp moved, others followed, and the method traveled with them. The windbreak ring, the double felt, the controlled breath of ventilation, the ledger habit of measuring instead of guessing. If you're still here with us, subscribe for more long-form survival stories, places where weather is the judge and craft is the defense. And drop a comment. What's the coldest night you've ever tried to sleep through, and what did you learn from it? By the next winter, families 2 valleys away were building tighter lower jers. Some added an inner liner to create a deeper air buffer. Some improved fuel drying racks to keep blocks off wet ground. Some began keeping their own ledgers outside temperature, inside temperature, fuel mass per day, because numbers don't care about pride. A local teacher copied the veterinary officer's diagram onto a slate board for children, because children become adults in a few winters, and the steppe does not forgive ignorance for long. This is how techniques spread when they're true, not by slogans, but by surviving better than the man who laughed. And if there's a single message the steppe repeats year after year, it's this: the frontier rewards what works. It does not reward habit. Years later, people would argue about whether Batsakan invented anything. He never claimed he did. The G-ear had existed long before him. What he changed was the way his camp treated it, not as tradition to be repeated, but as a system to be tuned. He made small choices that stacked into survival tighter tension bands. So the structure strengthened under load, thicker northern felt, where the wind punished hardest, a base insulation layer to blunt heat theft into frozen ground, deliberate ventilation to prevent smoke and carbon monoxide, dry fuel to keep the stove clean, raised sleeping platforms to escape the floor's cold sink, and a smaller heated zone when fuel ran low. The result wasn't romance, it was a ledger line. Outside minus 50 degrees Celsius. Inside plus 16 degrees Celsius. Fuel 18 kilograms per day, steady, controlled. Those numbers didn't make winter kind. They made winter manageable. They gave children sleep. They gave adults thinking room. They bought time, and in a place like this, time is the real currency. Educational note. This story is a reconstructed, historically inspired narrative based on documented principles of Mongolian jur design and cold weather survival practices. The physics described wind load behavior on round structures, the insulating value of trapped air layers, chimney draft, from temperature differentials, moisture management, in breathable insulation, and the importance of dry fuel are real. If you apply any of these ideas today, do it under modern building codes, fire safety standards, ventilation requirements, and local laws. Stoves, chimneys, and indoor air quality can be dangerous when handled incorrectly. This is not engineering or legal advice, only education through story. Out on the steppe, winter remains the court that never closes, but it does not demand brilliance. It demands respect, preparation, and designs that obey the laws of the world instead of arguing with them.